My review of the Sony NEX-5 has over 60,000 views on YouTube, and then I produced a short about the NEX-5 which has millions of views on Instagram and other social media platforms. So there's a chance you've purchased this camera in the last 6 months and you might want to know the best settings to optimize your camera for its best performance. Well, that's what this video is about. I'm going to show you all the best settings to change in your Sony NEX-5 camera. Okay, hopping right into the menu of the Sony NEX-5, the first setting we're going to look at is shoot mode, and we're just going to go in order of the varying settings here. Starting with shoot mode, obviously this is going to depend on your skill level. I prefer to shoot in manual exposure, which is just manually setting your aperture, your shutter speed, and your ISO. If you're able to do this, I'd highly recommend, because you're going to get the best results in manual mode. If not, I would recommend you start in aperture priority. The reason why I like aperture priority mode is because it's really just the simplest thing. All you have to adjust is your aperture, and your ISO and your shutter speed will adjust accordingly. So I'm using the kit lens. The minimum aperture value I want to set, or that I can set with the kit lens, is 3.5, because this is the kit lens. But if I adjust it, stop down a little bit, we can see that we're changing the shutter speed value, and the ISO is set to auto. If I wanted to make sure that I had a faster shutter speed, I could set my ISO a little bit higher. And now we can see that my shutter speed is also higher as well. If that feels too difficult, you can change it to program auto, which sets the aperture and shutter speed, but you can adjust settings like ISO and white balance, which is kind of nice, rather than just going in intelligent auto, which is completely automatic mode. You can't really adjust anything. Program auto is what I'd prefer if you can't do aperture priority, shutter priority, or manual exposure. Moving over to the camera settings, the first thing we're going to look at is AF/MF selector. I'd always encourage you to keep your autofocus on if your lens actually supports autofocus. The NEX-5, it doesn't have the greatest autofocus performance in the world, but this can guarantee that you're getting your images nice and sharp. There are lenses, though, that obviously you'll need to use if they're manual focus only, or times that if you're shooting video, that I'd actually recommend you shoot in manual focus with this camera, because the autofocus really suffers in video. So we'll leave it in autofocus for now. Autofocus area, this is where you can choose what type of autofocus area you want to select. So multi is just reading the entire scene. Center reads the center of the screen, so whatever is in the middle, it will focus on that. I usually prefer flexible spot. This allows you to change the location. So if I want to focus on this lens cap up here from Viltrox, I can dial that in, and now I'm focused on that. Okay, our next setting is autofocus mode. I like to keep this in continuous AF if I can. Sometimes it gets a little buggy, so then I switch into single shot autofocus, which will just capture focus on one point in space and then lock it right there. Continuous focus tries to continually hunt for focus depending on what your focus point is locked on. Some of these settings you'll see will be grayed out because of just the settings that we're in with a RAW file type and shooting in manual exposure. It eliminates some of these extra effects that you have access to. Moving on to image size. Now this is a really quick one. Keep your aspect ratio 3:2 if you're taking photos. Unless you're shooting like a YouTube thumbnail or something that needs to be in the 16:9, that's like that 1080p aspect ratio. So you could change it to there if you need like a thumbnail or something. Otherwise, keep it in 3:2. That's traditional photo aspect ratio. Quality, I always recommend shooting in RAW format and editing your photos. If you're someone who can't edit your photos right now, I'd encourage you to do RAW plus JPEG. And then we're going to show you some settings to make your JPEGs look a little bit better straight out of camera. But keep the RAW file type as well, because you might learn photo editing down the road, and then that lets you have access to the RAW files later. The last setting on here is just the movie file type. We need to make sure that's AVC HD. MP4 really compresses the heck out of these NEX cameras. So always shoot in AVC HD when you can. Okay, moving on to brightness and color. There are several things here that we need to adjust, starting with our exposure compensation. You don't really need to adjust this unless you're intentionally needing to overexpose or underexpose by a certain value. Usually I keep this at 0 unless there's something specific I'm trying to do. ISO. I'd recommend you keep your ISO, if you can, at 200, 400, or 800. All of these are very clean. As soon as you get up to 1600 and 3200, these get a bit noisier, but if you're in a better, well-lit environment, like a studio environment or outdoors, these are going to look just fine. And then if you can avoid 6400 and 12,800, these look absolutely horrible. I would not use these if my life depended on it. So go ahead and try to keep it at ISO 200 if you're able to. That will get the best results. White balance, I found that auto white balance for taking photos actually works pretty well. So go ahead and keep it in auto white balance if you can. And then since you're shooting in RAW, you can always change your white balance after the fact. Metering mode, I usually keep this on multi-metering, which reads the entire scene to try to equalize your exposure across the whole scene. If you change it to center or spot, it's gonna only read the center of the frame or a specific spot to meter at. If that's confusing to you, just leave it on multi and you'll be fine. Your dynamic range optimizer or auto HDR, just leave this off. I don't like when the camera tries to create like HDR images or tries to add like effects to the camera. I would keep this off at all costs. The last setting here is creative style. This is actually a very important setting to adjust if you can for shooting video and for taking stills if you're shooting in the JPEG format. I have found personally that going from standard, which is what it's normally on, changing it to the portrait mode, as you can see there, we're getting just a little bit less contrast. It just softens up the image quite a bit. I'm going to click this and then I have my contrast set to -3. My saturation still just at 0, plus or minus 0, and then sharpening down 1. This is gonna make your images look way better for JPEGs as well as for footage. I don't love the NEX-5 for video at all. If you've watched my review of this camera, it's really bad for video because you can't adjust settings. But if you're trying to use this for video, changing it into this portrait style will help a ton. Moving over to the playback setting, there's really nothing here that I would need to adjust. You can mess with these if you want, but there's nothing here that I personally would adjust at all. And finally, looking at setup, there's a lot of things here I want to touch on. So first thing is the AF illuminator. I always keep this off because I don't like a bright red light shining on my subjects when I'm trying to take photos. If you need it on to illuminate your autofocus point, you can turn it to auto. Auto review, I always keep off because I don't like taking a photo and then it immediately displaying it back on the image. I like to just keep shooting. And if I want to look at a photo, I will go in and I'll hit the play button to view that image. The grid line, I keep this off. I don't need the grid line on, as well as the histogram. I don't need it on either. Manual focus assist, I have to 2 seconds. I think 5 seconds is too long. All this is that if you're shooting in manual focus, it will kind of zoom in on your focus point for a couple seconds to make sure that you're able to lock onto your focus really well and then back out of it. Color space, leave it sRGB for sure. Steady shot on is totally fine. Release without lens. This is a very important setting to make sure you have enabled. If it's disabled, a lot of these lenses that are older or if they're manual focus only, sometimes these NEX cameras don't read like a lens is attached. So make sure you have it enabled so that no matter what lens you have on the camera, you're able to fire with. High ISO noise reduction, keep this weak. We don't want to add a bunch of processing in camera. We can always add noise reduction in post-production. Movie audio recording, please turn this on. You need to be able to record audio with your video recordings. Soft key settings are really important. Okay, we're gonna set our soft key B setting, which is this button right here, to ISO. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to, from the menu, be able to click your ISO button. Our other soft key setting is this button right here, which is the center button when you're shooting photos or video. This custom function is what you want it to set to. And this will let you change 3 functions to that button. So I currently have it set to white balance, autofocus area, and metering mode. You can change these to other settings as well. There is an instance in which you would want ISO to be mapped to this. So watch, I can change one right now. So instead of metering, I'll select ISO. The reason why you would want this is I will back out of this menu and change my autofocus area to flexible spot. So right now we're at flexible spot, which is great. The camera automatically changes it so that your focus area selector is mapped to that button if you're shooting in flexible spot, because you need to be able to change your focus point, right? So it makes sense why the camera is doing this, but then it locks you out of using the ISO button for this button, even if you have it mapped. So alternatively, you can set it to your, I'll show you again right here, your setup. I have it set to the soft key. So right now it should be that button, but it's not because we're in the flexible spot. So I also have it mapped to the custom 3 function right here so that when I click on the center button, it will give me option 1, which is white balance, option 2, which is autofocus area, and then the third page is ISO, and I can change my ISO right here. So the soft key settings are literally one of the most important functions you can change on your camera to have the best shooting experience. Beep, turn that off. You don't want the beep happening. Make sure your date and your time and your language are all set correctly. Power save, for this video, I turned it to 5 minutes. Typically, I have it either 1 minute or 5 minutes just because these batteries are really not good at saving power, so I recommend keeping it at a lower value rather than this 10 or 30 minute mark. LCD brightness, turn this all the way up. I adjust it to manual. Sunny weather is not even as bright as just changing it to manual, so I turn it to manual and turn it to +2. These LCD screens are not very bright, and I like to have it as bright as humanly possible. Display color, I love it black. I mean, it's just me, that's just my preference. You can choose white or blue or pink. These are very strange. I prefer the black setting for sure. You can do what you want there. Wide image, just leave this normal. There's no reason to change that. Playback display, manual rotate is what I prefer. This means that if you take a photo that's horizontal or vertical, it's gonna try to automatically rotate as you sort of pivot the camera. You can turn this on if you want. I prefer to have it off. Control for HDMI, leave that off. USB connection, mass storage. This means if you plug in your camera to a computer, you're able to access files, leave that way. Cleaning mode, if you want to clean the sensor, it performs a sensor cleaning. Version, this is important for you to know, and I'll get to that in just a second. And then the last setting that we would want to know where to find is the format button, and this formats your SD card to the camera. I always recommend formatting your camera with a brand new SD card every time you pop a new one in. And finally, the reason why I said the version was really important is because this camera had shipped with like version 2 or 3 back in the day. It depends on when you were getting this camera. This camera is like a 14 or 15-year-old camera, so it's probably still on version 1, 2, 3, or 4. But there's a latest version, version 5, which is a really important update. If you're able to get it, I really encourage you to do it. This is what the update covers. It adds the function to use peaking level and select the peaking color in manual focus mode. This is really important for those of you who use manual focus lenses or any sort of lens that you want to use manual focus for. To be able to see what is in focus with that focus peaking setting is such a valuable tool, and if you can get this firmware update, I highly recommend it for that setting alone. There's one other really important setting which changes the aperture setting function so that the setting is maintained when using the background defocus control or aperture priority movie recording modes. This means that if you set your aperture on this guy to f3.5, or I'm shooting on the 20mm f1.8 right now, I could set it to 1.8 and that aperture will be maintained, which is really important in video mode. One of my biggest gripes with this camera is that in video mode, you can't really control any settings. Well, version 5 of this firmware allows you to control the aperture, which is great. You still can't control your shutter speed, which is the most important setting when shooting video, but at least you can control your aperture to make this more usable for video. And the last important update, it resolves an issue where the battery may be drained even if the camera is turned off. I think that's super silly that that's happening, but this update hopefully fixes that. If your camera is like, leave it overnight and it's all of a sudden at 10% battery and it was at like 85%. That shouldn't be happening, but it might solve your issue if you get this firmware update. The caveat here is that I have a Mac system, and I think I found an NEX-5 update for Macs as well, but I could not get it to run no matter what I did. All of the drivers were just too old and out of date, and I couldn't get it to update on my newest MacBook Pro. So if you're someone who has a Windows computer, it might be a lot easier. It looks like it's supported with Windows Vista, Windows 7, Windows 8, and Windows XP. You might be able to get this firmware update, and it could really help you maximize the potential out of your NEX-5. I hope you found this video helpful. I'm going to try to do these kinds of settings videos for all of the cameras that I have. I have a ton of NEX cameras, the A5000, the A5100, RX100, all of these, A7 IV, A1. I'm gonna try to do more of these settings videos to help you out because it's the most common question is like, hey, what's the best way to maximize this camera or this? I'm gonna try to do this more often for you guys because you often have questions and I wanna provide you with specific answers. Thanks so much, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video. I'll see you in the next one. Much love.